Shave, and I'll end you. But the human went further than anyone expected. It started like any other day, but things quickly took a turn. The atmosphere in the office had always been tense, with a few people constantly at odds with each other. But this day, the air felt different, charged with something that no one could put a finger on. Among the usual mix of gossip and quiet conversations, one particular moment caught everyone's attention. The protagonist had always kept to themselves. They weren't the kind of person who sought out conflict or drama. They did their job well, stayed in their lane, and avoided unnecessary attention. But that day, something changed. Maybe it was the long buildup of frustration, the endless hours of being looked over and ignored, or the constant teasing and little jabs thrown their way. Whatever it was, it finally pushed them over the edge. Breath. Started with a simple comment, something small, something that on any other day might have just been shrugged off. But today, it wasn't small. Today, it was the last straw. The antagonist, someone who had been mocking the protagonist for weeks, made another one of their usual taunts. It was a remark meant to get under their skin, to belittle them. But this time, something in the protagonist snapped. Psst. Instead of quietly enduring it like they always had, they turned, their face serious, and delivered the words, "Shave, and I'll end you." Bear. It wasn't the words themselves that were so shocking. It was the way they said them. There was no hesitation, no nervousness. I offered a Scarred to wait a second. It was just a calm, collected statement that carried weight. The room fell silent for a moment, everyone unsure of how to respond. Some people were surprised. Others were too afraid to speak. The antagonist, who had been expecting a simple reaction, maybe a defensive remark or a retreat, was caught off guard. They didn't know what to make of it. The protagonist's words hung in the air, both an accusation and a promise. It wasn't an actual threat in the sense that it was meant to be dangerous, but there was something different about it. The protagonist had finally reached their breaking point, and the world around them could feel it. It wasn't the words that made them stand out. It was the shift in how the protagonist carried themselves. They weren't backing down. They weren't going to shrink into the background anymore. The antagonist, initially stunned, just laughed it off. They didn't take the threat seriously, assuming that the protagonist would apologize or back down. Rask. After all, they had always been the quiet one, the one who wouldn't dare make waves. But this time, the protagonist didn't flinch. Vampires. They didn't apologize. Instead, they stood their ground. And that was the moment everything changed. The people in the room began to look at the protagonist differently. They had always been the one in the background, the one who didn't speak up. But now, something new was in the air. They started whispering, wondering if the quiet one had been hiding something all along. Had they been waiting for the right moment to stand up? Or had something in them just finally broken? The protagonist didn't know what to expect next. They weren't sure if they'd gone too far, if they'd made a mistake. But there was one thing they knew for sure. They weren't going to let themselves be pushed around anymore. Whatever happened next, they would face it head on. The days following the confrontation were quiet, but filled with an undercurrent of unease. The protagonist kept to themselves as usual. But there was a shift in the way people interacted with them. The whispers began almost immediately, soft conversations that stopped when the protagonist entered a room. I hadn't expected that. The protagonist hadn't been trying to stir the pot or make things complicated, but somehow they had. At first, it wasn't clear if the protagonist had done the right thing. The initial silence that followed their bold words had made them wonder if they had made a mistake. The world had gone on. People had moved on. But something felt different. The usual routine felt off. People were talking about them, sure, but not in the way they had hoped. The protagonist started to realize that the words they had spoken weren't just a passing remark. They had stirred something up. And now, it seemed like everyone was waiting for them to make the next move. The antagonist, far from being shaken, responded in the only way they knew how. They continued to provoke, to poke fun, to test the protagonist's resolve. But it wasn't like before. Now, there was a nervous energy about them, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The antagonist had never expected the protagonist to actually stand up for themselves. They had assumed that the quiet, reserved person would always just let things slide, would always shrink away when confronted, but they were wrong. The protagonist wasn't backing down. They weren't engaging in any dramatic battles or heated exchanges. Instead, they were simply going about their business, doing their job, staying focused. But every now and then they would catch the eyes of their colleagues, and they could tell that something had changed. They weren't invisible anymore. One day the antagonist tried again. This time they came at the protagonist with a different approach. Subtle, almost like a joke. They made a comment that seemed harmless enough at first, but there was a sharp edge to it, a little jab aimed at the protagonist's character. The room went quiet again, all eyes on the protagonist, waiting to see how they would respond. The protagonist didn't flinch. They didn't react the way the antagonist was hoping. Instead, they gave a simple response, calm and steady.
"Is that really all you've got?" The words were delivered with such quiet confidence that the antagonist, for the first time, didn't know how to respond.
It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a victory. The antagonist's power was slipping away, and the protagonist was slowly taking back control. The next few days were a mix of tension and quiet curiosity. Some people began to approach the protagonist, not with pity or fear, but with respect. They started to wonder if maybe they had misjudged the protagonist all along. They began to see a different side of them, someone who wasn't afraid to stand their ground. But not everyone was so quick to change their opinion. Some still saw the protagonist as the quiet, meek person they had always known, unable to shake off the old image. But the protagonist wasn't concerned with how others saw them anymore. They had learned that it wasn't about changing people's minds. It was about staying true to themselves. They had learned the value of standing up when it mattered, even when it felt uncomfortable. They didn't need anyone's approval, and that was the most freeing thing they had ever realized. The room fell silent after the encounter. People stared, some unsure whether to speak, while others just exchanged glances. The protagonist stood there, barely moving, but inside their mind the wheels were already turning. What had just happened? It felt like a moment that would change everything, yet the world outside seemed unaffected by the tension that had just unfolded. First, as the days passed, the story of what had happened spread quickly. Whispers began to fill the hallways, and in the corners of the workplace, there were hushed conversations about the protagonist. Some were still unsure of what to think. Had they really done what they had been accused of? But others were beginning to see the protagonist in a new light. They weren't just a quiet individual anymore. There was something about them, something that now made others pause before crossing a line. They had become a symbol of unpredictability. Meanwhile, the antagonist, who had previously dismissed the threat, now had a much harder time facing their reflection. They had expected the protagonist to back down or apologize, but that didn't happen. Instead, the protagonist had chosen a different path, one that sent a message to everyone watching. The antagonist had underestimated them. Now they couldn't escape the realization of how they'd been outdone, in a way they didn't expect. Days turned into weeks, and the tension still lingered. The protagonist found themselves in the middle of conversations that had nothing to do with them. People now watched them with a kind of curiosity, almost as if they were waiting to see what they would do next. The attention felt strange, and at times overwhelming, but there was something else. Respect. It wasn't vocalized, but it was there, hidden in the way people looked at them, in the way the protagonist had handled the situation. For the first time in a long time, the protagonist began to realize they weren't just reacting to life anymore. They were controlling the narrative, even if they hadn't planned for it to happen this way. It was a strange power, one they had never asked for, but now that they had it, they weren't sure what to do with it. It wasn't all easy, though. There was still the matter of the antagonist. Their silence had never lasted long, and it seemed like they were just waiting for the right moment to strike back. Past, the protagonist could feel it. The air had changed. The antagonist, humiliated but not defeated, was planning something. Breath. And this time, they wouldn't make the same mistake of underestimating the protagonist. It didn't take long for the antagonist to make their move. This time they came with a plan, one that was more subtle than their previous attempts. They had spent weeks observing the protagonist, looking for weaknesses. Breath. They knew that brute force wouldn't work. No, they had to play this game differently. They had to make the protagonist question themselves. The antagonist started by speaking to others, planting seeds of doubt. They were careful with their words, making sure not to sound too forceful. Maybe it's not so simple, they would say. But maybe there's more to the story than what everyone saw that day. At first, these whispers seemed innocent enough, but slowly they began to take root in the minds of the people around them. The protagonist's image, once flawless, started to show cracks. Some began to wonder if they had been too hasty, too bold in their actions. The protagonist felt the shift almost immediately. Breath. People who had once shown respect now treated him with caution. Conversations seemed to shift when they entered a room. It wasn't just the antagonist that was making their move. The whole environment was changing. The protagonist had become the subject of discussion, not always in a flattering way. But they couldn't let it go on any longer. They couldn't allow themselves to be torn down by rumors and doubts. Rest. It was time to confront the situation head on, to stop hiding behind the walls they had built and face the antagonist, not just physically, but mentally. They knew they had to do more than just defend themselves. Grasp. They had to take control of the narrative once again. The protagonist had been pushed far enough, but they were done being reactive. They had learned from their past mistakes, and now knew that they had to act on their terms. One afternoon, the protagonist found themselves alone with the antagonist in a quiet corner of the building. The air between them was thick with tension. Neither of them spoke at first, but both knew this moment had been coming. The protagonist could feel the weight of their decision. Rand. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about something deeper. About showing that they were in charge of their own destiny. With a calm but firm voice, the protagonist finally spoke. "I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish here," they said. "But I'm not backing down. This is me. This is who I am now. And I won't let anyone change that." The antagonist stared at them, trying to find something, some weakness, to exploit. But it wasn't there. They had expected fear, or at least hesitation, but all they saw was resolve. The antagonist's eyes narrowed. Great. They had underestimated the protagonist before, and now they were paying the price. The power was no longer in the antagonist's hands. The protagonist had taken it back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt like a battlefield, and in that silence the antagonist realized something important. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about respect, and the protagonist had earned it, not through force, but through something far more powerful. They had found the strength within themselves to stay true, even when everything seemed to be falling apart around them. The antagonist, defeated in more ways than one, turned and walked away. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no words of revenge. Just the realization that they had been outdone, in a way they couldn't have predicted. The protagonist had won, not by fighting back the way others might have, but by simply being who they were. As the days passed, the protagonist's confidence grew. They knew that they had faced the worst of it and come out on the other side stronger. People began to treat them differently, not with fear, but with a newfound respect. They had proven something that couldn't be taken away. Their strength wasn't in how they reacted, but in how they stood their ground. The antagonist, once the one holding the power, was left to deal with their own reflection, now realizing that it was the protagonist who had truly come out on top. The protagonist didn't need to say anything more. They had already said everything that needed to be said, with nothing more than their actions. And in that silence, the protagonist finally understood something that would stay with them for the rest of their life. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say. It's what you do when you stand tall and face the storm head-on. The days that followed the confrontation were quieter than the protagonist expected. At first, there was an uneasy calm, as if everyone was holding their breath. People didn't know how to act. The tension that had been hanging in the air for so long seemed to dissipate, but had left behind a strange sense of anticipation. The protagonist had not just outsmarted the antagonist, but they had also taken back control of their own narrative. The feeling of power that had come from standing up, from facing the conflict head-on, was different from anything the protagonist had experienced before. Yeah, it was a quiet kind of strength. Not the loud, boisterous kind people often think of when they imagine power. No, this power came from knowing that they could take a stand when it mattered most, that they could hold their ground and remain true to themselves, even when everything around them seemed to be trying to break them. As the protagonist walked through the halls of the building, they noticed the difference in the way people looked at them. It wasn't fear or avoidance, but respect. The whispers had died down, and now the protagonist could see others speaking to them with a sense of reverence. It wasn't just that they had won a battle. It was that they had shown everyone that they were capable of standing tall, no matter the odds. In the weeks that followed, the protagonist's life began to shift in ways they hadn't expected. People who had once treated them as invisible, as just another face in the crowd, now sought them out for advice. Others asked for their opinion on things they would have never dared ask before. It wasn't just about the confrontation with the antagonist anymore. The protagonist had become a symbol, not just of power, but of resilience. People admired the way they had handled themselves, the way they had stood up for what they believed in without resorting to violence or intimidation. But even with all this newfound attention, the protagonist remained humble. They hadn't sought out the spotlight. They hadn't done what they did for recognition or praise. It was never about showing others how strong they were. It was about showing themselves. They had reached a point in their life where they no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. The act of standing firm, of refusing to back down, had been for their own growth. It had been about reclaiming their self-worth and proving to themselves that they were more than just a passive observer in their own life. But as time passed, the protagonist noticed something else. The antagonist, once a force to be reckoned with, began to fade into the background. They were no longer the center of attention. Their attempts to regain control over the situation had failed. The protagonist, through their actions, had made it clear that they would not be easily manipulated or intimidated. The antagonist, in the end, had nothing left to prove. They had been outclassed, not by force, but by the protagonist's unwavering determination. What had started as a simple offhand remark, a threat made in the heat of the moment, had evolved into something much bigger. It had sparked a chain reaction that changed the course of the protagonist's life. They had gone from being someone who quietly followed the rules, someone who kept their head down and avoided conflict, to someone who had learned to stand up for themselves in the face of adversity. This transformation wasn't just external. It wasn't just about how others saw them. It was about how the protagonist saw themselves. They had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that strength comes not from being able to overpower others, but from being able to stay true to who you are, no matter the situation. The world had a way of testing people, of pushing them to their limits. But it was those who chose to stand tall in the face of pressure who were the real winners. In the end, the protagonist realized that they had gained something far more important than victory. They had gained peace with themselves. They had discovered the quiet power that comes from knowing your worth, from refusing to let anyone define you. And as they walked through life from that moment on, they knew that they would never be the same. They had faced their fear, stood their ground, and come out stronger on the other side. The story of the protagonist's journey spread beyond the walls of the building. It wasn't just a tale of conflict and resolution. It was a story of personal growth, of overcoming self-doubt, and of learning that true strength lies not in defeating others, but in conquering your own insecurities. People who had witnessed the events from the sidelines found themselves inspired by the protagonist's courage. Some even began to reflect on their own lives, wondering if they too had been hiding from their own challenges, waiting for someone else to fight their battles for them. The protagonist had shown them that they didn't need to wait for someone to save them. They had the power to make their own choices, to stand up for themselves, and to be proud of who they were. And so, as the protagonist continued on their path, they knew that they had become a symbol for something greater. They had shown that no matter how small or insignificant one might feel, they had the power to create change, to influence their world, and to live a life that was true to themselves. The story was no longer just about what had happened on that one day. It was about the transformation that took place over time. The growth that happened not just in one person, but in an entire community that witnessed the power of standing up for what's right. In the end, the protagonist didn't need anyone to tell them they had won. They knew it because they had found something far more valuable than victory. They had found their own strength. And with that strength, they were ready to face whatever came next, knowing that they had already proven to themselves that they could handle anything.